Good evening, everyone. My name is Rahul Verma. I work here at the Center for Policy Research. Just to confirm from people who are on Zoom, am I audible? Can you hear me? If not, then we'll make some technical adjustments. Sounds good. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining here in this room as well as on Zoom. This is the fifth conversation in a series of conversation on how India votes. And today we are going to discuss urban-rural differences in Indian politics. And we have with us Professor Ashutosh Varshney. Professor Varshney is Director of Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia and Sol Goldman Professor of International Studies and Social Sciences at the Brown University. Professor Varshney is a friend of the center and has been a long-time India watcher, has been writing on Indian politics on many important themes. Some important books that he wrote, one is on democracy and development, urban and rural struggles. The second book is again a seminal contribution to study of political violence, largely Hindu-Muslim conflict in India. The name of the second book was Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life. And then there was a book which is largely a collection of his important papers, India's Probable Democracy. Professor Varshney is also a regular columnist for the Indian Express. Thank you, Ashutosh, for joining us today. Partha Mukhopadhyay is an in-house expert, and a short description about him is that he knows everything that there is to know. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Previously, he has been part of the founding team at the IDFC. He has also worked at Export-Import Bank of India and with the World Bank. He has written extensively on issues related to urban governance. Most recently, he was the chair of Working Group on Migration, Government of India, also member of high-level committee on railways restructuring, and then on the Technical Advisory Committee of Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. Thank you, Partha, for joining us. To just begin the conversation, and then it would be largely between Ashutosh and Partha Mukhopadhyay, I just wanted to frame this conversation by saying a few things. First, as many of you know, the idea behind this series is to look at each theme or each factor that shapes perhaps voting behavior in India, and we don't have a good, even mid-level theorization of how Indians engage in political arena and vote. The idea is to look each of these themes separately, and hopefully in the run-up to 2024 election, collectively we manage to create a body of knowledge or information about how Indians vote. And the reason to have this topic, urban-rural struggle, urban-rural differences in Indian politics, is that in 70s, 80s, and 90s, in the political economy literature on India, this was an important theme, and many people have written about it, Rudolph's and even Professor Varshney's book that I mentioned. But somehow, as India started rapidly urbanizing in the 1990s, the comparative nature of this study got lost. And so you have a body of literature that largely looks at villages and panchayats, and then a body of urban part of it, municipalities and other things, but the comparative nature of like what's happening in urban India and rural India, that got somewhere lost. And from that body of like scattered pieces of evidence, let me just sort of like say a few things. One, what we know is that urban Indians are less likely to engage in political arena. And that information is largely from the fact that voter turnout in urban India is lower than the rural India. In fact, previously a study by Myron Wiener in 1976 on India's urban constituency, and then very recently by Adam Orbach, suggests that till late 70s, early 80s, the turnout in urban constituencies used to be higher. That got reversed in the 80s, and now we see rural India turning out more in comparison to urban India. Recent electoral data indicates that rural seats are more competitive, and two indicators of competitiveness would be that victory margins are actually lower in rural constituencies, and effective number of parties are actually higher there, meaning more parties are competing in rural seats. Third, and perhaps Ashutosh Varshney is going to throw more light on this from comparative perspective. BJP, in some ways, its performance over the years in urban and rural constituencies is an anomaly to comparative voting behavior literature. Generally, conservative right-wing parties receives much of their vote share or votes in rural parts, whereas BJP in its the earlier avatar in 1990s and 2000s was seen as urban party. Its penetration in rural India began with 2014, and in 2019 they did really well even in the rural part of the country. And finally, given that there is rapid urbanization and it's also lopsided urbanization, something which Partha is going to definitely point out, India by 2025 or 2030, in absence of census data, we can't really know how India is urbanizing, but the expectation is 40 to 42% of the population by the end of this decade would be living in urban areas. Now, what part of it will be in mega cities, what part will it be in tier 2, tier 3 cities, that's not precisely known. But as India urbanizes, how it is going to change the political engagements, and especially since new delimitation is due in 2026, right? And when the last delimitation happened in 2008, the number of seats in urban pockets actually increased, Bangalore being a good example, right? And so going forward, how do we see these differences to play out in the electoral arena? With that, I'll first invite Professor Varshney to make his presentation, and then Partha to not only respond, but also add some questions and hypotheses for younger lot to study these questions. Thank you. Ashu, floor is all yours.
Thank you, Rahul. Am I audible? And audible on the Zoom as well? Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be at CPR, which I see as my intellectual home in Delhi, and I've seen it that for years. And so I look forward to the discussion, and especially what Partha has to say, who knows more about urban political economy than any other economist I know. So, but the correction here, it's not the urban-rural divide in urban politics, urban-rural divide in Indian politics. We'll fix it before it's uploaded on the website. And I will stick very close to the slides, which I've been doing now for some time. I fundamentally disagree with the claim that at least some people used to make, that PowerPoints give too much power to those who don't have a point. I think what PowerPoints do is they take away the poetic flavor or poetic flair of presentations, and but they bring in prosaic precision, which I'm happy with. Let me start with the boundaries of these remarks. I've worked on this for the last 8 hours or so. And here is one way to think about what I can do intellectually legitimately. So while I published on urban-rural struggles in India's democracy, the Cambridge book from 1995 and 1998, and I'm currently working and writing on politics of urban governance and urban access to the state, EPW and American Journal of Sociology, I have not done primary research on voting, which is a very large part of the series. Needless to add, voting is different from development and public service delivery. So these are very different so-called outcome variables that we wish to examine. Moreover, like the great American classic of the Michigan School, where I taught for 7-8 years, The American Voter, first published in 1960 by Philip Converse et al. And revised many, many times. This is a sign of a classic, that every 10 years people revisit the data and say it's a revised version. So the latest is 2000, I think, 12 or so. But unlike that, we don't have a book called The Indian Voter. The basis for such a book has been created by the truly massive database put together on Indian elections by the CSDS Lokniti team. Since 1993, I was present at CSDS when the early sprouts emerged under Yogendra Yadav, when that was the state elections of 1993. And then they became more ambitious in 1996 onwards. They became both national and they covered state elections as well. But that book is still to be written. Why do I say that? Because there's a key question, as in the American voter, which is the following. How stable is party identification? What my discipline calls partisanship? How stable is it among the voters? And what proportion of the vote is simply strategic? I don't want to waste my vote. And therefore, I will go with what I perceived to be the emerging trend in my constituency, in my election district, or sometimes the idea of strategic voting it goes beyond the district. But strategic voter is not a partisan voter. That fundamental distinction remains. So I'm reminded of a seminar in 2014, before the 2014 elections at MIT, where Pratap Mehta and I were the panelists, and our chair was Abhijit Banerjee. And Banerjee's last question was, so how many votes will BJP get? Seats will BJP get? I said between 230 and 245. And Pratap's answer was either 180 or 280. And Pratap was right. And the reason he was right is that he was paying attention to not partisanship, but to strategic voting. And when I told him that that's what it was, he said, yes, you can interpret it that way. And that is the reason. Then the last 2 weeks, the way the wind is blowing, especially the last week, that can't be easily modeled, right? It can be modeled theoretically, but what exactly is the proportion that goes for strategic voting? We know quite a lot about it in America now. We don't in India. There is strategic voting is beyond doubt. That's why you can get either 180 or 280. Right? That is the logic for that kind of remarkable claim. So with these research limitations in mind, I'll present most of my data from Lokniti on the urban-rural questions. They've been very generous in sharing their data, but they are the main source now for this, as Michigan was for years and years in America. But let me start with some conceptual questions, not overburden you with statistics, just conceptual issues first, which are very important in the study of cities. The largest conceptual issue goes back to what we would call a Weberian ideal type. Not that Weber wrote about this, but it's generally believed that sooner or later, the city is where subjects become citizens. Meaning that individuals come to believe that they have a bundle of rights, that such rights are not an expression of government kindness, and that rights are legally given entitlements. Regardless of class, ethnicity, or religion, citizens access public services, a correction here, directly. Education, health, public order, not through intermediaries such as lords or as is often the case in rural settings. In other words, a Weberian state run by impersonal rules comes about when cities dominate the political landscape. That is the larger conceptual understanding. Rural societies, more reliant on traditional categories, have differential bundles of rights for different sets of people. Peasants submit to law, citizens to states. This is an empirical statement. I'm making no normative claim here. You could go in the Jim Scott direction and call it a moral economy, as opposed to patron-client linkage, right? You could do that. So this is simply a statement, empirical statement, however normatively you wish to judge it. I prefer citizenship over moral economy, over clientelism, etc. So obviously that is my normative position. The empirically disrupted real type, as opposed to the Weberian ideal type, is what? A Weberian ideal type may well come about when urbanism reaches the level of a Switzerland. But meanwhile, the citizen-subject dichotomy is broken by some common empirical patterns. That is to say, patronage and clientelism is also evident in cities and often based on class, ethnicity, or religion. Even today, even after America has become 98% to 99% urban, lots of Black citizens of America access the state through their representatives, not directly. A lot of them. And certainly don't access the police station directly. Almost a very large proportion wouldn't access the police station directly without some kind of patron with them. They won't do that. And this is also perhaps true of much of Europe, where the migrants don't access, a lot of migrants, not all, a lot of migrants don't access the state directly through intermediaries. Migrants certainly exhibit that pattern. Some migrants go directly, but a very large proportion, depending on which state you're, which country you go to, you'll get this pattern. Now, let's go to two master narratives of Indian politics historically: caste and religion. How do they work out? How do they operate in the cities versus the villages, right? When urbanization proceeds further, what should you expect? Caste hierarchy historically is a system of ritual and social domination, and not only a division of labor. A division of labor, that is to say, each caste having its own occupation, is allied with pollution and purity, and a differential bundle of rights and obligations. OBCs and Dalits were not equal to Brahmins and upper caste. This is not equal citizenship. This is a fundamental violation, caste system, of the idea of citizenship. In urban India, the hierarchy and ritualistic aspects have become weaker. Why am I here? I think I'm wrong. Sorry. Just to return to this question, what was expected and what has happened? Sorry, I think I jumped to slide number 4. And I call it Ambedkar's wish on caste and Nehru's longing on religion. The Indian version of the Weberian story can be told through Ambedkar on caste and Nehru on religion. For Ambedkar, the village was a caste-based cesspool, especially for Dalits. Urban anonymity, as opposed to the danger-ridden intimate knowledge of the village, would make cities a site of liberation for Dalits, is the claim he's making. For Nehru, religion was the bane of traditional India. As India urbanized and or modernized, religious enchantment would head toward disenchantment. I'm using now Weberian terms. Loss of faith. And class would replace it. He expected and argued, as it did in Western Europe. So it's worth asking, have caste and religion become weaker in urban India? This is a larger political question. This is not a strictly voting question, it's a larger political question, which also we are discussing in this meeting. If they have not altogether disappeared, have they at least weakened? What do we know? And so here now we return to the slide which came a bit sooner than it should have. Caste hierarchy. Just a brief comment here also on Ambedkar's wish here. If you ask yourself why India until the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s, did not have a third tier of elected government, the best hypothesis to explore, as Madhav Khosla in his constitution book hints at, but doesn't fully engage, is that Ambedkar was opposed to an elected third tier of government, because it would basically reproduce social patterns of exclusion and dominance at the village level for sure. And if he was going to be opposed to village level third tier, then it was not going to extend it to the city level either. Village level was the main level. 83% of India was in villages at that time, right? I think this is something worth exploring. And I know that many would think it's a critique of Ambedkar. It's not. It says, you read Madhav Khosla's account of what he thought village was like and why locus of power could not be, as Gandhi thought, at the village level. Locus of power could not be at the village level. Gandhi wanted village republics, and Ambedkar said, no, they will be basically, they will be cesspool republics. Okay, so where are we with this argument? Yeah, something happened. Why can't I move? I have to get rid of this window. Okay, good. So, in urban India, the hierarchy and ritualistic aspects have certainly become weaker. There's a lot of research to show that, though less so for Dalits than for lower OBCs, let's say. Less so for Dalits, which that's the bottom of the hierarchy. But a conceptually more important issue for the purpose of politics, larger politics, is the transmutation of caste into a political phenomenon. Caste has become an interest group, which was never true traditionally. Its primary aim is now to extract resources from the state and facilitate electoral bargaining. That was not its traditional role. So ritualistic aspects have as you'll see in a moment, which should expect, the theoretical proposition would be that ritualistic aspects of caste have faded into caste as an interest group. And the issues of dignity also figure. Everyone who's read what Mulayam Singh Yadav has said about caste politics, what Lalu Yadav has said about caste politics, that's quite similar to what was said in South India starting in the 1920s. The logic, the discourse is the same. The method is different, on which in a moment. Movement politics. Okay, here is the difference then. Movement politics preceded electoral politics in the South and Maharashtra. But it is the latter that has dominated low caste politics more or less everywhere else. Electoral politics, not movement politics. And Amit Ahuja has a tremendously good book on this, tremendously good argument, where the distinction between Dalits and movement politics and Dalits and electoral politics is very well brought up. The logic changes. The transmutation of ritualistic caste into political caste has progressed farther in the South, less in the North, which also implies that movement politics brings about a larger transformation than a purely electoral politics. That is also an Amit Ahuja claim, not my original claim. I'm repeating that claim. The North has nothing comparable. This is my claim. The next one. North has nothing comparable to the transformation of Nadars in Tamil Nadu and Yiduvas in Kerala. Nothing comparable. Caste, in short, has not disappeared, but has changed its form. And the key question today, with which we should end, we should think about it quite a lot, given the debate of the last 10 years. Is caste hierarchy returning in some form in urban India under Hindu nationalism? Why is this question important? Because Hindu nationalism and lower caste assertion of caste equality conceptually and logically cannot coexist. Happy to explain this further. Is it also empirically true? We need to figure out, with empirical research. But if Hindu nationalism completely submerges Mandal, this result is logically not inconceivable, namely a return of caste hierarchy. In what form, we have to investigate, but in some form in urban India, whereas the trend was in the opposite direction. How about religion? What does the evidence show? Data don't show a Weberian, Nehruvian disenchantment. Urban residents in contemporary India pray more often, attend places of worship regularly, and participate more in religious gatherings compared to rural citizens. The big argument of Chibber's book, Pradeep Chibber's book, Religious Practice and Democracy, is this. And it's based on CSDS data on religious observance. Urban India is more observant. Whether this is not a claim about religiosity, it's a claim about observance, right? And you can deduce religiosity from it if you want, but there's some relationship between religiosity and observance, but this is a clear argument about observance. This role of religion is more akin to the US, this is my claim here, to the US than a radically disenchanted Western Europe. Why? A possible hypothesis is the following. In Western Europe, a political rebellion against an organized ecclesiastical hierarchy and its practices led to the weakening of mass religious sentiment over time. Politics after late 1980s, politics became an agent of secularization and an attack on the Catholic ecclesiastical establishment. In the US, there was no such organized religious establishment against which a rebellion was either necessary or could have been organized. In India, Hinduism also has no single ecclesiastical establishment. There is no Vatican in Hinduism. And the same is true of other religions of India, including Islam, we should note. There is no Vatican in the Indian Islam. Only or for that matter, other in Islam in other parts of the country. Only Shiism, you can say, is organized in a very vertical way. But Sunnism is very Protestant in the way it's organized. Right? Without having an ecclesiastical hierarchy. So a direct clash between the religious order and the political order was not easily conceivable with Indian materials. Long-term secularization may still take place in urban India, but politics is unlikely to be its source. This is just a hypothesis given the structure. Something else has to happen. Voting now. 2004-2009 data up to 2004, not just up to 2004-2009, a big conclusion of CSC local data was that the two national parties did very well in urban and semi-urban constituencies, less well in rural constituencies, where regional parties fought very well. What about urban-rural distinctions in 2014 and 2019? Are they fundamentally different from this existing conventional wisdom? Or wisdom that conventionally existed before 2014. The trend identified above is weaker now. The BJP's penetration of the rural constituencies is very pronounced. Data on that very quickly. Primarily because of that, in 2019, the combined vote of the BJP and Congress was well above 50% of the total vote literally for the first time since 1996. 1991 also, I think, but I need to double check. 1996 for sure, since then. The key questions now, how the BJP vote will be distributed compared to the second largest party, the Congress. We need to watch that in the coming elections. And in national elections, will regional parties revive their strength, or will they remain prominent primarily at the state level is another important question for scholars of voting. How many Lok Sabha seats are urban? Just an orienting question. How much of it is? In the aggregate, national elections are still decided in village India, not state elections in most urbanized states. But Gujarat, we can't make this claim about Gujarat, we can't make this claim about Tamil Nadu either anymore, or Kerala, right? The three most urbanized states, I think. And Partha will correct me if I'm wrong, in India. But marginally speaking, if you apply marginal economic reasoning, right, then urban seats can be decisive even in national elections. How? If the rural seats are split roughly equally, then urban seats become decisive, not otherwise, not in the aggregate, not otherwise. But on the whole, urban issues will become more prominent when urban seats are close to 50%, not in 2029, perhaps 2034 onwards. That should be predicted. 2029, the way Partha has analyze the proportion of urban citizens in India, I think Partha might say it will happen in 2029, but not according to official statistics that we have. There's no particular reason to go by that. You can come up with your own yardsticks of what is urban and what's not. So urban is defined in the CSDS locally data set is 75% or more urban, and that's 57 seats out of 543 is 10.5%. Semi-urban is defined 25 to 74.9% urban, and that's 144 seats. That is 26.5% of the total seats. And rural, less than 25% urban, is 342 seats out of 543 is 63%. So 63% is rural and 37% is urban, right? Yeah. By this definition, which is not very different from what the 2011 census said about urban. Urban proportion was basically 32 and rural proportion was 68. That's but in this electoral definition that they have, it may not be universally acceptable or uniquely acceptable the way they have cut it, but we don't have a better way of cutting it, right? We don't have a better way of cutting it. Now, this requires a bit of concentration. This is urban-rural division in Congress and BJP vote in 2014 and 2019. So pay attention only to what I have where I use where I've colored the data, where you have the red data as opposed to the black data. In 2014, Congress won 18.9% of rural vote, and BJP won 30.2% rural vote. I'm subject to correction, but I'm very confident, 99% confidence level, that this is the first time it happened. That BJP won greater rural vote than Congress did. This is 2014. Semi-urban, 20.6% Congress, 20.9.5% BJP. Urban, Congress 18.3 and BJP 39.2. If you see the transition to 2019 and look at these figures once again, the same figures, Congress got roughly the same proportion of rural vote, but please note, BJP went from 30% of rural vote to 38% of rural vote, while its vote share increased in each of these categories, semi-urban as well as urban, each of these, but that share increase was 3 to 4%. In its rural vote went up by 7.5 to 8%. This is why we say BJP has very seriously penetrated rural India. You shouldn't call it an urban party anymore. You should not call it an urban party. Whether or not you call it, it's not even an upper caste party anymore, but it's certainly not an urban party any longer. So here is the same information summarized for our purposes. Rural, 8% increase, semi-urban, 4% increase, and urban, 3% increase. The greatest advantage that BJP's seats derived in the last election was from the countryside. Someone who studied this, my teacher, Myron Wiener, studied this first in 1976, the paper to which you referred. He would not have believed this, that this is possible, that Bharatiya Janata Sangh or Bharatiya Janata Party will penetrate rural India to such an extent that it will leave Congress behind by a huge margin. It's almost double of Congress's vote in rural India. I wanted to split it into urban rural also. I couldn't do it, and I hope to send it to Rahul a little later, maybe in a couple of days. I couldn't do it in time, but basically I want you to note here is something that we've all known, that the BJP is no longer just an upper caste party, though a greater proportion of upper caste votes for it than of middle OBCs and what they call middle peasant caste, and also Dalits, right? So note that what CSD is called middle peasant caste, basically it seems to me what they're talking about is what Srinivas called dominant caste. Yeah. And then rest they're categorizing as OBCs. They don't want to call dominant caste OBCs, which in some ways is not wrong. Yeah, it's not wrong, right? Because the sheer dominance that Reddys and Kammas and Yadavs and Patels and Nayars express, OBC doesn't quite catch that dominance.
Yeah, the term OBC officially also.
Yeah, in some places not officially OBCs either, right? So to call Nayars OBCs is a complete misnomer, right? Whatever this the All India hierarchy says about non-Brahmins in southern India, to call Chettiars in Tamil Nadu OBC would not make any sense. Yeah. To call Reddys and Kammas, Reddys in particular in Andhra, OBCs also would not make any sense, right? So I think there is some validity here, and one should note that OBC vote went up from 34% to 44%. And most importantly for our consideration, and I hope to give you the urban rural breakdown of that also, Dalit vote went up from 24% for BJP. Every fourth Dalit voted for BJP in 2014, and every third Dalit voted for BJP in 2019, which also was inconceivable to earlier scholars of Hindu nationalism. It was simply inconceivable, something like this. Muslim vote remains static at 8%. A class you may not hear. This is a disaggregation that we can do without. Yes, we can. except to note that BJP gets twice as much vote. I think I can read it carefully. Yes, more than twice as much vote of the poor got more than twice as much vote of the poor as Congress did. This was also not conceivable earlier. These are all new developments in electoral politics. This is a party which has departed significantly from its earlier moorings. To how to conceptualize them, I have something to say on that in a moment. Final remarks. What are some of the most important urban-rural questions now? Some, not all. This to me is very important. Is caste hierarchy returning in some form in urban India under Hindu nationalism? This is a claim that Gilles has made. This is a claim Christophe Jaffelo has made. This is a claim that the book New BJP has seriously contested. So we have to sort out which side of that debate we are on. Is upper caste dominance being re-established? If Hindu nationalism completely submerges Mandal, I'm repeating myself, but it's so important that it's worth repeating. If Hindu nationalism completely submerges Mandal, this result is logically not inconceivable. A return of some kind of upper caste dominance. Can Hindu nationalism and low caste assertion of caste equality coexist? Conceptually difficult. What do we know empirically? Let's figure this out. Conceptually, actually, it is somewhat moderately put, conceptually impossible, actually, if you go through the categories of under one condition, under the so-called Govindacharya social revolution solution. It's possible. We can discuss it. But so Govindacharya was expelled from the party. And I don't know whether his ideology remained within the RSS after his expulsion. The literature I have read is not conclusive. It's not against that, but it's not conclusive. In national elections, will regional parties revive their strength with or without an alliance, or will they remain prominent primarily at the state level? I think it's also a very important question. Can the emerging India alliance reverse the rising BJP penetration of rural India? This is also a very important question. If you cannot reverse the BJP penetration of rural India, you just cannot win enough seats. We can do the calculus for you, the arithmetic in no time. You simply cannot. You have to reverse as an alliance trying to be ambitious. You have to reverse BJP's dominance of rural India today. Not dominance, penetration. It's not more than 50%, but penetration of rural India. If you cannot do that, you will not be able to get as many seats as you would like, or a respectable number of seats. Can urban issues in electoral politics acquire overall salience before India becomes 50% of the total vote? I think it's an interesting question. I want to see what Partha has to say about that. You could argue in a very political sciencey way that given the economic power of urban India, it doesn't have to be 50% of the voting demography before it exercises its weight. You could do the American calculation here. You could say 40% urban multiplied by its economic power will generate a lot of urban weight finally in India's electoral politics. You could make that claim, but should we? And that's open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Easier to, if you want to interject, it'll be easier. Okay. Thanks, Ashu. That was very nicely laid out. So, but in the interests of generally having a more evocative discussion, let me sort of put together 2 or 3 questions to begin with, and then sort of walk through some of the issues that always concern me in practice. As Ashu alluded to many times, the definition of what we call urban is fraught, right? And therefore, Kanchan has a paper on how to measure urban, but fundamentally urban constituency, because people like Sanjay Alam have done a very interesting work on it. Adam Orbach and others have done work on it. Kanchan herself suggested a particular way of doing it. But all of that essentially, Kanchan. So, but all of that essentially still works with the definition of urban as the census of India defines. And the census of India is a very hard definition, as I've often said, to become urban in India. Right? So the first question that one would ask in this case is, why do we expect an urban voter to be different from a rural voter? Is it the fact that that person stays in smaller settlements? Is it the fact that that person is, in the Weberian sense, sort of governed by certain social mores which are sort of not urban? Or is it very lazy shorthand for saying the farming voter is different from the non-farming? And so, since after your sort of almost your first major work was on that, on the cultural classes, we're just curious about how you see this intersection between the rural and the farm in a political sense. And because the other question in India is that there are large swathes of Indian constituencies where more than half the working population is engaged in non-farm activity. None of them are by any definition of the census. But if I essentially sort of say that the rural is essentially about farm and non-farm, then I would like to redraw this entire map that we are thinking about, and what is urban, semi-urban, what is rural, and all of that story. So that's one chunk of that. It'd be interesting to sort of also ask the corollary question is, whatever you have outlined about how rural and urban are different in India, and you mentioned very clearly that the urban European is very different from the urban American. And I wondered if you had any ideas about what the urban Latin American was, the urban African was. But let's say Latin America, which has still some now engagement with electoral structures for a while, but to what extent is that part of the story? But it's very stark, the partisanship and the rural-urban story in the US is incredibly stark. The maps are, you have the cities all in one color and everything else in a different color. And to a large extent, we sort of saw something similar happen in Turkey in the recent elections that Erdogan came in through. And so I'm just wondering whether this sort of distinction that we're trying to make here, how useful as an analytical category is it outside of the Indian story? So within India, what is it that we are expecting? What do you think is sort of driving this urban-rural difference, if there is one? And across, the countries, are we thinking of something that's somewhat different? The other story is more to do with, so if I step back from individual characteristics and sort of think of politics as engaging with the state. The state in rural India and the state in urban India are very different beasts. The state, I would venture to say, there's of course some degree of generalization, some nuance that is lost. The state in rural India is tactile and visible. The state in urban India is distant and almost invisible. There are two reasons for it. One is that sheer scale matters. If you're living in a city of 20 million people, it's difficult to think of a state when We're sitting in a village of 2,000 people. But it's also the nature of services that you're actually providing. If essentially what you have in urban India is a multiplicity of agencies providing you different levels of services, the complexity with which you have to engage the state. If I want to look at health, I have to go to X. If I want to look at land, I have to go to Y. If I want to look at solid waste, I have to go to Z. If I want to go to electricity, I've got to go to P. And whereas in rural India is that the kind of land up at the district office, the panchayat office, and maybe some of that works. And if that is the characterization, then one of the reasons why urban and rural voting behavior might be different is simply the fact that the rural voter sees much more to be gained from engaging with the state, much more interest or vested interest in actually making the state perform than the urban voter. And that's partly also because the extent of services with which you bypass services in urban areas is perhaps, even if you are rich in the rural areas as possible, you might end up going to the local school, whereas in the urban areas, you are essentially able to bypass public services, private hospitals, structures, and so on and so forth. And if that is the case, then do you see the possibility that these urban-rural differences will blur as the rural becomes more urban in the sense of distance from the state, or rather when the options for people to bypass the state in some sense actually increases? Right? Which is the second is, so this bunch of things is more like a sort of governance question. And to what extent do you think the differences in electoral and voting behavior is driven not so much by differences in how you are thinking about people's conception of themselves as citizens or subjects, but largely the environment in which they are sort of engaged in. And one way of looking at this is interesting work that I find very little of, unfortunately, that happens outside. A lot of work early on by young colleagues here, Bhanu Joshi and Arundhati Mehti did some very interesting work comparing turnouts in local elections versus turnouts in state elections for the same geographies. There is Kanu, I don't know, there's in the room, Bhanu and Pranav Sidhwani did some very interesting work looking at different types of colonies in Delhi and what kind of participation they had in local elections. And so in that particular sort of context about local elections, and what we see, broadly speaking, is turnouts in panchayat elections tend to be much higher and dependable than turnouts in urban local body elections. And if you sort of have more anecdotal stuff and recent work, I think also by Adam and Tariq on the migrants, you see much more engagement in trying to go back to the village to vote much more in the panchayat elections than so much in the MP elections. And in that sense, which brings me to the final point that I thought I'd sort of, and this first set of questions, which is issues around migration. And now this is an ongoing debate in India about how, are migrants getting disenfranchised? Are people sort of moving because they are sort of unable to vote? Is there some other way of moving to much more, we do allow postal votes in India for certain categories of people, but very rarely used, very little used. So as we have much more urban rural migration and much more, should we have more engagement of the urban migrant in the electoral process. The interesting question there is, while there has been a fair amount of discourse around, let's say, and there's also a recent work, I think, I forget, on this, there was, I think, some kind of an RCT where you sort of looked at providing information on both sides and about registration processes, as well as to the parties saying that these kinds of processes are going on. So both the demand and the supply stuff was put together, and they did see an increase in participation in voting. But there is also the question, especially with the nature of migration in India, which is much more circular than a more stable long-term movement, as to where exactly does, which political theater, which political field does the urban migrant want to participate in? Does he or she want to participate in the city, or does he or she want to participate in the village? And it's in that context that finally sort of end with the kind of work that, let's say, Mukulika has done on her cultivating democracy stuff, or recently Adam and Gabriela have done on looking at the geography of citizenship story, is what you laid out this sort of Weberian dichotomy, but I sort of felt that you weren't subscribing to it very strongly. And so if you really have this kind of circularity of migration processes and so on, even if it were that the two notions of citizenship were different, I'm not quite sure that I would, where I would come on that given the literature. Would the circularity sort of lead to a sort of blending, a sort of mean reversion in both places, where the notions of citizenship become much more evened out, much more similar because of this constant interaction? So, and also it's in that context, I'll sort of end with asking you to also look at, asked to look at your cultural work, but also your other work, which looked at riots. And one of your core conclusions, if I'm not paraphrasing you incorrectly, is that essentially riots were an urban phenomenon. And do you see that largely because of the fact that the continuance of riots was essentially dependent on the response of the state, and the state behaves differently in urban and rural? Or do you see the urban and the rural person as somehow much different in the anonymity that Ambedkar spoke about, makes the urban person more amenable to being a rioter as compared to the more less anonymous rural person? And if that is the case, then what does that say about the nature of urban and rural politics and their ability to engage with the kind of phenomena that we are seeing today?
Thank you, Partha. Ashu, if I may add a couple of questions just to Partha's points. And those who are on Zoom, I'll request you to put your questions on Q&A box and they reach to me. So first question is largely related to Partha's question on definition measure. For example, Lokniti CSD's categorization is at 75, 25 to 50, and 25% below.
To 75.
And so what I'm thinking, like, let's take the example of Gurgaon. Now, Gurgaon has two kinds of voter. One will get Mewat and new kind of voter, and the other one is living near Cyberhat, right? And if we study things just at the constituency level, then Gurgaon perhaps will be considered as a semi-urban constituency. But these two segments are going to behave very different, right? And so what I'm generally asking, how do we think about who is a rural voter, who's an urban voter? Does it depend upon which type of constituency they are living in? Because in a 20, like where you have a 75% urban voter, the rural voter would be behaving very differently in that constituency compared to, or maybe not. I'm just sort of like guessing about the definition and measurement. The second one, just to complement to Partha's story, Partha largely focused on the state story, which is how whether urban and rural citizens look at the state and their interaction with the state is different. When we think of politics and voting, the party story also needs to be thought of. And I think the parties are organized very differently and perhaps much more active in urban areas. Whereas if you go to rural areas, I think active party organizations at block level, at least in North India, is difficult to find. South may be much more organized in that sense. And so party, and I'm thinking perhaps like in like 2000s, that distinction must have been a little bit higher because the way parties might have been mobilizing would have been different, but now everywhere it's mobilization through WhatsApp groups. And so is the urban rural distinction because of the penetration of social media and parties relying on social media is going to blur. And final, this is like not a conclusive sort of like evidence, but some of the things which you mentioned about as a question on Hindu nationalism and other things. I think conceptually, we also need to think a little bit more before what the empirics are pointing out. So Pradeep and my paper on 2019 elections using CSDS data, we actually find empirically that now there is like earlier Hindu nationalism, majoritarianism, religious practice, and people who like on the social justice question, there was an overlap. Those who were Hindu nationalists, they were also majoritarian, they were also anti-social justice, and perhaps practicing religion more. The data now suggests that there is basically these are not overlapping categories. And perhaps if they are becoming not overlapping categories, what you were, putting as a question, whether this is conceivable or not, that's why it's happening. I don't have an answer, but this is something which is happening. Similarly, on Dalit question, the penetration which has happened, the BJP's penetration among Dalit, what we are seeing that the BJP, like Dalits who are voting for a BJP on certain sort of like what we call as ideological platform, they are very similar to where upper caste BJP voters stand on the question of like some of the questions that you asked in your politics and society between election question, like Jangan Man and beef eating and all those things. Their position is very similar to. So Dalit BJP voters have very similar to positions to what upper caste BJP voters. I'm not saying it's sort of like ideological alignment happening. Maybe they started voting for the BJP and so they have adopted the position, or they had the position and that's why they're voting for the BJP. So some of these things. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Because you provoked a lot of thought.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very helpful as we move forward. So let me just go chronologically, the way it was, the order in which it was asked, the question was asked. So definition of urban is fraught. Yes. Think of this question actually a bit comparatively. So I have a subsidiary interest in Chinese urbanization. Beijing municipal office. Beijing is a city with a provincial status. There are 4 such cities, 5 such cities, 4 more in addition Beijing, which have a provincial status. So these are not your routine municipal offices, Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Chongqing, and which is the fifth, I don't recall now. So I was interviewing the deputy administrator of Beijing's municipal office. And I asked her, what's urban? And she said, after a 5-minute discussion, said, let me put it to you very clearly, briefly, and correctly. Urban is what we call urban. Urban is what the Communist Party calls urban, period. So India and different countries define it differently. And then India has this definition about size, density, and occupation, right? Those three combined. And you can disagree with the size, you can disagree with the density, you can disagree with the occupational breakdown there, and you can get a very different result. I've looked at Indonesian conception of urban also. They have 10 yardsticks. India has 3, Indonesia has 10. And China says, we define what is urban. There's no proportions issue here, which is true over time and place, right? And so if you look at the UN definition of urban, they can't come up with an intersubjectively acceptable definition of urban. They simply put together the definitions of each state to give you the data that in the world is this much urban and this much rural, right? So it's not a. So and while all of that is true, I do not know how to resolve that. I don't have a better answer than either the census or Partha. I don't know how to solve this problem, right? But I mean, the implications, I'll get to that. But if you have a better solution, Partha, you were you in a discussion with me some 4 or 5 years ago, before COVID, you said India is already nearly 50% urban, you said, according to your calculation. I think you should put it out and let's have a debate. You should put it out what the basis for that claim is.
No, the claim here is, as a political scientist,
Yeah.
you just laid out these 3 features that you talk about: occupation, size,
And density. Yeah.
Which do you think affects political behavior? So forget the definitional story. Let's cut out where the census and I differ, and come to the constituent metrics. And or rather, let me make the question simpler. How do you think each of these things might affect political behavior?
So the Indian version of the Weberian argument, as I said, is partly Ambedkar, partly Nehru. Yeah. Ambedkar is relying heavily on a world-known idea about urbanization, namely anonymity, the rise of anonymity, and departure from intimate knowledge of your fellow villagers. Who is what kind, who's a Dalit, who's a Bangi, who's not, who's a Chamkar, who's a Reddy, who's a Brahmin, all of that. So it's not written on the face. It's not a racial category. It's not like black and white. It's not a racial category. So you ought to have intimate knowledge or either of the family or of names, right? Last names in order to, and first names in South India, in order to generate a description. And that can be only with intimate knowledge, that cannot be on anonymous basis. And city provides anonymity. That is the Ambedkar argument. So Dalits will find a site of liberation. Now, it turns out that he was overly idealistic about this, but there's no doubt that Dalits in the city are different from Dalits in the village. And I have also no doubt, though I can't prove it, that Madhav Khosla's argument that fundamentally Ambedkar was opposed to elected third tier, I think is right. I think it's right. That is the reason India did not have a third tier elected government in 1950. And because if you see his argument, he says, what will the government there do, given the size and given intimate knowledge? It will reproduce. It will add political legitimacy to social government.
In fact, the seminar issue which I gave you, Shyam Babu has
written exactly this, right?
exactly this.
Yeah. So,
Panchayats have facilitated dominant caste entrenchment.
yeah, and so we need to see in Constitutional Assembly debates what exactly he's saying there. Now, the implication, his argument about anonymity, all over the world, the urban seminars that I took as a student, or even as a faculty, basically emphasize size, anonymity, diversity in occupations as a way to separate the urban from the rural. Right, so Indian definition has size, density, it doesn't talk about diversity, density, and occupation. And the American sociological literature, which has done more on urban than right, it talks about diversity also. Now, you're asking a question about what of these would determine political behavior. So I think it's a multi-factor equation. I don't know what the coefficients are. But you are adding one more very interesting point to it. This is the surface area question that Patrick first heard from Patrick, and now in the Patrick Heller, and now it's in the Orbach Crooks was in a paper where they say the urban state, municipal state deals with how many, and per representative. Per municipal corporator deals with how many people, and panchayat deals per representative deals with how many people, and rural state deals with how many people. That therefore, the claim that rural citizens of India have get greater rewards from engagement with the state, and therefore political behavior would be different from urban. So that is a fourth point in this, or fifth point in this equation. And is going to be a multivariate sort of problem, and coefficients are not known. But the fifth one ought to be noted: this new idea that urban surface area, that state is not visible in the city, or hardly visible in the city, and the state is quite visible in the countryside, and they are claiming that rural governance, rural elected government, something that I've had a hypothesis for a long time, I didn't have the data, that rural elected governments work much better and are stronger and have more power than urban elected governments of India. Right? So this will be, I think, so the answer is that all of these would matter. I don't know which has higher coefficient, which is more important, right? So that's the answer, but this literature, surface area literature, is adding a new variable to the standard theory of urban voting did not have the surface area question. That's a new argument. That's a new variable.
So yeah. If I can just, I'm not going to ask you to push on that, but
yeah.
It's since you spent that much time on caste and how anonymity and freedom, the other category which changes, and there I think it does change dramatically, is gender. And so do women voters in urban areas vote very differently from women voters in rural areas? Do we know anything about this?
I don't think we know enough. I don't think this comparison has been made. I would very much like to know what the empirics are. Very much like to know. I think it will be a very important research question moving forward also. I don't think we know. Do you? Yeah, I don't think the data, the CST's data will tell us anything.
No, we can
sort it out. I have some gender data. We can sort it out. But this is I don't think it's been tackled as a research question, and it's an important research question that should be tackled. Right? Urban European versus urban American. Latin American urban. US cities very stark. Turkey similar. I think you would say England also. So what's the idea here? Urban, what do we know about American cities and their political behavior? So America says rural, the way the term rural is defined, rural American is defined in political literature, as opposed to census, right? Rural American basically includes small towns of America, right? Agriculture is just 2% of GDP or 3% of GDP. It can't be, right? And I think rural population is basically 4% or so. A lot of urban people live in the countryside, and you can just drive to a town center in 45 minutes. So you want to live in the countryside, it's much better living. if you can get to the work in 45 minutes. So anyway, so you'd have not more than 4 to 5%, and some estimates, it's a question of how you statistically cut it, right? Some estimates say 10% of America is rural, right? But anyway, it's basically rural and small town versus cities. And the entire Trump social base, political base, was middle America. And even in my state, Massachusetts, the city, Boston gave him some 17% vote in both elections. Hillary got 80% and Biden got 83%. That's Boston for you. But we have rural Massachusetts also towards Western Mass, where Gilles is teaching now. There the proportions are higher. Similarly, California is completely blue, right, at the state level, but rural California managed Trump quite a bit of vote.
Like if you remove the coastal part.
So the coastal cities, the coastal America, all blue, and middle America, except the very industrial parts like Illinois, south of Illinois, it is completely red. Right. So, and this is the small town, and there the cities might give you some differentiation, but you're right, it's stark. Now, that to me is not a religious, non-religious issue. Right, because American cities are also quite religious, not the coastal cities, but lots of cities would be very religious. That to me is the impact of globalization. Globalization destroyed the industrial middle belt of America. All the city migrated, the jobs went to China and to Asia in general. And that became and the coastal elites, both California, Massachusetts, and New York, they were wonderfully networked into global supply chains. They made a lot of money. They became very rich. Route 28 in Massachusetts or the place near MIT, you had no sign of any devastation there, just flourishing. San Francisco flourishing, except for the homeless on the streets. So yes, the cities were networked into global chains and they benefited from globalization. The industrial middle belt was devastated, which became the basis for Trump, which is probably the story in England also. The Brexit vote, leaving vote was all in the smaller towns and not in London and not in the big cities. So that's a globalization story. I don't think that story it's a Weberian disenchantment story or a more traditional political categories analysis story. Latin America, you will have to tell me a bit more. I do read quite a bit, but my sense is that Latin America did not benefit as much from globalization as China did or as India did. So there is possibly, and it's very unequal to begin with. GDP coefficients are very high, and except in the south, the deep south, the three cities of the deep south, Gini coefficients touch 0.5, 0.6, even in Brazil 0.7 before Lula. So once you have that kind of inequality, then very different classes are going to benefit from globalization. Right? It's not like China that almost everyone was lifted. China's poverty came down from 700, according to the World Bank, 700 million below the poverty line in 1981 to what? To roughly 29-30 million today. I was in China last week, and there was a presentation on this. 29 is all you get below the poverty line. 29 out of 1.4 billion people, that's 2%, not 700 million. Right? This is quite a change, and globalization was the driver. Trade over GDP in China reached around, before the financial meltdown of the West, it reached something like 60% trade over GDP. This is how networked China was. Right. Anyway, so that's a globalization story, I think.
So in your multifactorial story, you would privilege occupation over density and
I know I would like to do the empirical there in America, yes. In America, yes. In the multifactor story, yes. America, yes. I don't know about India, right? In America, yes. Yeah. We've already talked about how rural local governance is stronger in India than urban local governance. We've already talked about that's the third question. Turnout in panchayat elections higher than municipal elections, precisely for the same thing. You get more out of the panchayat. You don't get much out of the municipal corporation. One of the architects of local government amendments, Manish Shankaraya, in a long conversation once said, urban amendment was basically an afterthought. The entire attempt, policy energy was focused on rural governments. The 74th was an afterthought. Once you did the 73rd, or you figured out the architecture of it, then why are you leaving out the city? That's when the thought of emerged. It's an afterthought. And I think Mani is right about that. It's an afterthought. So 74 is not so well thought through. That was not the focus. That's not where India lived. That was the idea. India still lived in the villages, right? That's where the elections are decided. That's where politics are. Whatever we think of as Delhiites and Bombayites, whatever we think, that's not where elections are decided. Migrants getting disenfranchised. And what is the role of secular versus more permanent? I think it's going to be one of the most important questions in the emerging politics and political economy of India. I don't have very firm, well-studied, deeply thought answers to this very important question, and I would like to think more about it. But Partha, as always, has this intriguing thought which should be explored. The intriguing thought that Partha is proposing is that secular migrants, because they live in the city and all vote in the villages, their notions of citizenship, urban and rural, are likely to converge a little. So the stark differences between urban notions and rural notions through the migratory chain, are those stark notions we're going to be less stark. This is a very intriguing idea, Partha, and I think we should explore this. I don't know the answer, but it's obviously very, very plausible as a hypothesis to be explored, right, in empirical research. Riots, urban, yes, my book said that, and I will say something about the book and then how things have changed. Riots were, however you cut the data, give the rural riots the most expansive definition. It's not more than 6% of deaths. 7%, I think he said. 7% of deaths, basically, at best. Then it could be as low as 3%. No, that partly is a question of scale. You can't get 2,000 deaths in a village, right? Which you got in Bombay, which you got in Ahmedabad,
and Delhi.
And Delhi. You can't get that many deaths in the village. But you raised a very important issue, which has been discussed in riots literature a lot, which is that big rioting requires anonymity. And I have done a few hundred interviews on that during that book, during research for that book. And I kept asking the riot-torn mohallas of Aligarh and Hyderabad, the 3 cities we riot-torn in my book, Ahmedabad. Did you know who came to kill? He said, no, I didn't. It was some other mohalla, some other neighborhood. There was, I think, only 1 out of maybe 100 interviews. He said, no, we knew who came to kill. Did you know who came to kill? Who hurt your child? Who hurt your husband? Who hurt your daughter? No. Right. So now, this is not statistically generalizable in a technical sense, but after you've done 100 interviews in riot-torn cities, and only one person is saying they knew the killer, right? Then I think it's reason to believe that this story about anonymity, riots require anonymity, is a good story, is a plausible story, and it's a provable story, right? So you've already hinted at that. The other issue which complicates the discussion, but it's worth putting on the table, because the other part of violence that has been researched, other than riots on which I worked, and Stephen Wilkinson did, and Paul Brass did, and some others later, we were the first in the new round of research, these Brass, Wilkinson, and I. The other is civil wars literature. Civil war violence is different from riot violence, right? And riot violence is also different from pogrom violence. And riot violence is also different from lynching violence. What are the conceptual differences? Quickly. Riots are defined as a violent clash between 2 mobs, however organized, racially, religiously, ethnically, whatever, right? two mobs, and the role of the state, there may be doubts about the neutrality of the state, but the state doesn't drop the principle of neutrality. And this is a very important difference practically, not just conceptual. The state doesn't drop the principle of neutrality, right? Modern state should not drop that principle, right? That's what we think modern state is about. In pogroms, the state looks away, doesn't intervene. And therefore, only some riots of India in our book could qualify as pogroms. Only some. The state looks away or participates, right? The state looks away is more common, while a vigilante mob is going at a hapless group, right? And we can now. Civil war is where this is, first of all, the scale is different. Secondly, not only the state drops the neutrality principle, but one of the combatants, no one is hapless there, everyone is armed. The two combatants, one which is supported by the state, one which is against the state and which is targeted by the state, is armed, not hapless. Right? So these are conceptually very different categories, they generate very different kind of political dynamics. Since I wrote that book, what are the changes in India's riot politics? One, India's riots now increasingly look like pogroms. Not two mobs going at each other, but the state looking away on behalf of one mob. Right? They increasingly look like pogroms. Secondly, conceptually, what is the difference between lynching and riots? Riots are two mobs going at each other. Lynching is one mob targeting one or two people and finishing them off and attacking them violently, right? That's very well studied. That's a different category of violence. Generates very different kind of politics and organization. So India's communal violence is increasingly taking the form of pogroms, not riots. Or riots very quickly become pogroms. Delhi riot on the first day was a riot, and the next 2 days was a pogrom. I can show you with data. I wrote about it. It became second and third day pogrom basically in 2018, right? 2018. So it's become more a pogrom, and communal violence is taking the form of lynching for the first time in India. Lynchings in India, we've done this work, right? We investigated all this. Lynchings in India took basically three forms in the past, before the contemporary phase. A Dalit man could not marry an upper caste woman. Not possible. And if he tried to have a relationship with her, lynching was very possible and would be allowed by the panchayat. Okay. And that's one form. The second form was, this common elsewhere also. Big traffic accident and you chase the driver down and you lynch. Third, as in many parts of the world, black magic, right? Black magic has always been connected with the idea of lynching. You pick a mob, tracks down who this magician was and lynches him to death, right? There was never Hindu-Muslim lynching or lynching of Muslims by Hindu mobs. We don't find that. There is no evidence in my work. I couldn't find that anywhere. I went back. Every incident is clearly recorded there in our database. That I did with Stephen. No, it's not there. We don't have evidence of Hindu-Muslim lynching, or Hindus lynching Muslims, or Muslims lynching Hindus. And some, you can think about that in Kashmir Valley, right? Or you get the parts of Hyderabad where it's equally matched, basically. Parts of Aligarh are equally matched, the two communities. So
many cases that villages not lynching each other, like in Dadri, like in Rajasthan.
Right.
No.
Yeah. That's all new. That's all new. This is all new. This didn't happen earlier. This is all new stuff. It was Dalit versus upper caste. Dalit man trying to marry or having a relationship with an upper caste woman, not the other way around. Other way around is okay. Right? This is the same problem. The black man having desire for a white woman in American South between 1880 and 1930, lynched. Not the other way around. A white man could have desire for a black woman. That was never object of lynching. The same thing here. Upper caste man can have a desire for the woman. That's not the problem. The problem is the other way around. Right? So this is in this way, riots today or communal violence today are changing, right? So this is a pretty long-winded explanation, but I thought I would tell you. In some ways, therefore, you could also say that there will be greater proportion of rural riots or rural forms of violence, communal violence in India than used to be. That's the other issue. Muzaffarnagar is heavily rural, was heavily rural, right? No is rural, right? Was pogroms, this is not straightforward writing anymore, right? This is either lynching or pogrom, that logic is different. That can stretch into, go into the countryside. Right? That's not mob slashing. Okay.
So,
Can I?
sorry, I leave,
Yeah,
and if you find some time, we can discuss so many things,
sure.
so many points, because in Muzaffarnagar, I had been at some district magistrate. And the one thing you told that the village administration is stronger than urban. I have been municipal commissioner Ragra. I have so many experiences.
Okay.
So, but it will take last time, one to one.
Happy to chat, yes. Happy to chat. That's not my conclusion. That's a large, widespread conclusion. And that could be wrong. I mean, surely arguments against that are very welcome. Yeah, I think Gurgaon problem is a serious one. And I don't have resolution. You're raising a very important question. A lot of cities would have that character, right? 75% urban, 25% rural. And the 25% rural part is very, very different from a cyber city called Gurgaon, even though it's categorized as, right? I think that's absolutely correct. It's a very important problem. And it's possible that a lot of cities will have that character. Yes. Gurgaon is the best known, but there are going to be places around Bangalore or Chennai or Hyderabad could take that form. Huh?
Actually, one of the more interesting things is purely on a different stuff, this work by Bhanu, Kanu and Pranav.
Yeah.
What they find is the poor rich, the poor live in richer neighborhoods, vote less than poor live in poor neighborhoods, and the rich who live in poor neighborhoods vote more than the rich who live in richer neighborhoods.
Wow.
So there is a
Terrific.
interesting environmental story that sort of comes in.
Right. You raise parties, I won't know. I think you're a master of that. So you and Pradeep should solve this problem for us. And not all of us can talk about it authoritatively. You're the masters of political parties. You tell us whether I think it makes it very plausible that WhatsApp and social media are blurring the urban-rural questions on political organizations. Yeah, so I think so. Now, I think we'll need more empirical evidence for your claim that while in the past, Mandal voter and Hindu nationalist voter were very distinct. That's your last point. And that was the basis for a lot of work, including my work, that these two ideologies cannot be brought together. They are fundamentally at odds. And what conceptual innovation can you make? And that the only solution was the Govindacharya solution in the RSS philosophy, which is his notion of what was it called? Social engineering. So Govindacharya was claiming that you can't get Dalits and OBCs into the Hindu fold without giving them dignity. You can't revive the old caste hierarchy, right? They won't come to you. And so post-Golwalkar RSS philosophy seemed to be embracing that. And I think Gilles and Christophe are saying something very different. And it'll be good to get some data on this. If you have data, you should put it out. I think the data in New BJP is not very clear because you could get, remember an old concept in political research was vertical mobilization versus horizontal mobilization. This is something I touched upon in the seminar the other day. This was a very powerful duality, a powerful conceptual differentiation. And the claim was that you could mobilize, low caste can be mobilized in two ways. One, under the leadership of the upper caste, while the lower castes do get something out of that kind of mobilization, but upper castes are using, if you will, to use the Gramscian notion of hegemony, the standard notions of caste hegemony to bring them in. Right? That's vertical mobilization. Horizontal mobilization, lower castes break away from upper caste dominance and they organize as lower castes across villages, across cities. Right? This was a path-breaking distinction that modernity of tradition, the book proposed. Now, so vertical and horizontal couldn't be brought together. You seem to be saying they're being brought together. Now, how exactly would that happen? I need to know. If empirically you're showing that those Dalits and OBCs who are either joining or voting for BJP, now it's two in a row. The 33% Dalits who voted BJP, 25%, they are accepting upper caste hegemony, or they think that they're getting the Govindacharya kind of dignity in the family. I don't know the answer. That their voting is clear.
Yeah.
And that a tribal woman has become the president of India is clear. That representative politics has included some major, some Dalit figures and OBC figures is also clear. Mr. Modi himself is an OBC. All of that is very clear. However, the basis for so many Dalits and so many OBCs embracing the BJP, is it acceptance of vertical hierarchy in some form, or is it that they're getting dignity out of it? I think it has to be sorted out. I'm not sure it's very clear. It may be that Christophe and Gilles have a point. I don't know. Or as opposed to what you are arguing, or as opposed to who did Nalin, as opposed to what he's arguing. I think that debate is not settled.
See,
that debate is not settled. We need to have
them is on a different empirical feedback, which is basically both of them are doing is looking at the caste of politicians, right? Whether, and largely MPs and MLAs. What I'm trying to suggest, so I'm not looking at the caste, I'm basically looking at the voter data and saying that if you look at these voting population for BJP, their ideological sort of moving is very different.
Almost like a Milton Singer type satirization.
Yes. I mentioned I to develop it most fully. So the form of vertical mobilization that would be dignity enhancing for the lower caste would be Sanskritization, right? That's not straightforward sort of domination vertically, but the lower castes are beginning to pay attention to once again to Sanskritization, and that is surely one way you can try the Govindacharya thesis. But he was ideologically a revolutionary figure, clearly, while paying attention to this problem within the RSS framework. I never thought he succeeded, but this could be one form in which that ideology can be pushed. We need to talk to Dalits and OBCs who are voting. Why did you vote? Are you getting a Sanskrit? We have to form that question, in a survey research. It's a survey research question. Yeah. And we need to get the good, faithful, we need to get honest answers to that. And I have done that for some other research, so I think we can do it. But I don't think we know.
Yeah, no, we don't have a good idea.
I don't think we know. Yeah.
So should we take some questions here and then on? So people who are on Zoom, just send your questions and it will get to me. But let's take 2 or 3 questions from the room first. Please, let's collect 3 questions.
Thanks for the recognition. My name is Tanish from University of Delhi. My question is to Professor Ashutosh. Sir, you mentioned that caste and Hinduism cannot go together. Just to confirm again that caste and
Caste assertion and Hindu nationalism cannot go together.
And Hindu nationalism cannot go together, but caste
unless the lower caste assertion is taking the form of, that's not assertion, that acceptance of Sanskritization as an upward mobility model. Do you see what I'm saying? Right.
No, I'm trying to convey that.
Go ahead.
Yes. caste assertion and Hinduism cannot go together. Hindu nationalism, but caste eventually is a part of Hinduism. So it's like saying that if this water in the glass is caste and this glass is Hinduism, they cannot go together. Even they they are a part of, they are connected to each other, although they are different. But yes, if they are voting for BJP, if caste is the reason that is making people to vote for BJP, and then class is also the reason, then why are we differentiating it? Because in the end, it's the same thing. We can divide it in for research, but at the end, at the conclusion, we do come to see that it was one single entity divided into many parts in the previous. So I hope you got it through the example.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Shakun. I have a couple of questions. The first, of course, is in my work, I study Delhi, and one of the questions that I get a lot, and I don't have a very good answer to, is how do we account for exogenous shocks like COVID in terms of voting turnout, when a lot of people went back to their villages or their towns and they may have never come back. So that's sort of an exploratory question. I don't have a good answer to it either. And the second question is, we hear a lot about the story of urbanization. Like India is rapidly urbanizing. We have these new census towns. They are urban in status, but eligible for rural schemes. We are urbanizing as a country. But the story that we've heard today also is that voting still tends to be, very rurally dominated. So then what is the urbanization story vis-a-vis voting in elections in India? Are we going to expect that as the country urbanizes, people are going to vote less? Is the BJP going to lose their foothold eventually? What can we predict based on the fact that we're urbanizing, but also the party, at least the party machinery, has organized itself based on its rural base?
Am I audible? Okay. So Professor Jean Trace has characterized Hindutva as a revolt of upper caste. And is one of his essays in Jean Trace has characterized Hindutva in the backdrop of 2019 elections as the revolt of upper caste against exactly. So what are your views on this evaluation?
So on those three questions, there are like largely related. Someone wanted a clarification on Hindu nationalism submerging Manalism. That's one question. Second,
What is the question?
can you clarify?
What does it mean for?
What he means by Hindu nationalism submerging Manalism? And second question, like when we're talking about BJP and urban-rural politics, it seems when BJP was an urban party, it was an urban party of North India, right? BJP never had that kind of penetration in Southern India where urbanization rates have been higher. So someone wants to know about how should BJP plan to penetrate the urban politics of South India, if you have any such strategies.
They don't need my advice. So Hindus and caste are the same. Why divide them? I have no idea where this is coming from, but let me try and answer. And I do have an idea, but that's not the issue. There has to be a substantive answer. Ambedkar argued that precisely because caste and Hinduism are so integrally connected, Hinduism should be annihilated. Gandhi disagreed. He said there can be reform of caste system, you don't have to annihilate Hinduism. That's a fundamental, apart from the representational question, the fundamental distinction made in the 1930s. Your fight is not with me, your fight is with Ambedkar. Your fight is also with Ram Manohar Lohia. Your fight is also with Phule, and your fight is also with the entire Dravidian movement. And your fight is also with Kerala's Gandhi, who led the universe. Now, ask yourself, why are they saying that? They're all Hindus, but they think that there has to be a lower caste rebellion to achieve justice, dignity. Either the lower caste have to go out of Hinduism, or within Hinduism that has to be achieved. Ambedkar, in the last 6 months of his life, embraced Buddhism. So I think the answer to you is that a very large number of lower caste intellectuals, politicians, and not just upper caste people like me. I'm an upper caste guy. I was born a Vaishya. I never did any business. My grandfather did. We became government officers, etc. But this is not, that's not what upper caste. Lower caste people are challenging a lot of that. Even today, 61% of upper caste voted for BJP, but only 33% voted for Dalits. The reason I even mentioned that is because that was theoretically completely unexpected. Right? So that is your challenge. Your challenge, you have to convince them that what you're saying is right. In fact, they will not disagree with you that what you're saying is wrong. What you're saying, they will not say that you're wrong. They would say that's precisely the problem. The fact that you have this view is precisely the problem for Lohia, precisely the problem for Phule, precisely the problem for Ramaswamy Nayak, precisely the problem for Ambedkar, the greatest of them all. There's absolutely no question in their minds about this, that this is a problem that needs to be solved either by stepping outside Hinduism or within Hinduism. Gandhi said within Hinduism we can solve it. Okay. COVID is an exogenous agent here of politics. You put it very well, primarily because so much of return migration took place, right? And big numbers. So I think you're saying something that Partha was hinting at, that that sort of migration should have an impact on rural politics. Conceptually, yes. Empirically, you have to sort it out. Conceptually, yes. Yeah. The second question you asked, that we believe India is rapidly urbanizing, and we also make the claim that rural vote is still the determining vote, except when you apply marginal reasoning. When that is to say, rural vote is equally split, then cities become very important. Roughly equally split cities. So one is a rate question and one is a level question. The urbanization rate of rapid urbanization is a rate question. It might reach that level very soon. Then when it's a level question, then either as if 40% multiplied by economic power or 50%, then yes, urban issue will play a very big role in democratic politics. Right, but the way you put it is one is a rate variable, the other is a level variable, and they can't be compared. Therefore, right, a rate can generate a level, and then they can be compared. Upper caste revolt against I see. This is not simply not rare. This is also Christoph Jaffalo. It's an upper caste revolt against Mandal politics. If it is an upper caste revolt against Mandal politics, they have managed to persuade a lot of OBCs, nearly half of OBCs and nearly a third of Dalits, that the upper caste revolt is right. Right? The many conversations that I have had in different parts of India, you will have different versions of the argument that is an upper caste revolt. Gilles also makes this argument, incidentally. Gilles, Christophe Jaffelo, and Jean Grace. I don't think they can be dismissed out of court. The whole question of what kind of consciousness the Dalit and OBC voter has today, as opposed to simply voting, I think that has to be investigated. And once we've investigated that, then we can answer this question. It's sort of ties up with the vertical horizontal issue.
Just take off the caste tax.
Huh?
Take off the caste tax. And then basically, let's check it. I'm just wondering the data, there should be some of that data.
Yeah.
If you haven't. The Dress story was, if I recall correctly, and I'm very bad at this stuff, that the revolt was against social welfare and excessive structure, which is in some sense similar to the US welfare queen character.
Correct.
So if that is the case, it is not the caste identity that is driving the story, it's the class identity.
Yes, but very good.
And if that is the case, then you shouldn't be any problem having richer OBCs and richer Dalits
Joining you.
joining you, because we're now moving to a class story under the caste.
But that's not the Jaffalo-Bernie story.
I'm just-
I'm glad you bringing this distinction, because a class story can be told, right?
But even in the class, as you
Yeah.
pointed out, the data, there is a greater penetration of the
Yeah,
poor.
yeah.
And
That's a very good part of. But the Bernie story is about upper caste revolt against Mandal, and they managing to persuade. The problem in that story is, how do you persuade nearly half of OBCs and nearly 1/3 of Dalits to join you, even though you're revolting against their interests? The answer theoretically elsewhere in the world is that you can vote against your interests, and you can vote in favor of some kind of identity which you find useful. So the whole idea of why blacks can be Republicans is something like that, right? In American politics. So you can get that kind of argument. But this is a bigger story than the black story. 85% of blacks vote Democratic. Only 85 to 88, only 12% vote Republican. So this is a bigger story. We're talking about 1/3 of all Dalits and 45% of all OBCs. This is a very big story. And we need to figure out, I don't have an answer. I think that what Jaffalo and Bernie are proposing needs to be empirically investigated. We can do it through survey research. It's not hard. We can figure out why exactly they voted this way. In the CSDS Lokniti data, they don't ask you why you voted this way. That is with respect to only certain questions. On national security did you vote, right? But it's not, the social categories are all there in the survey, and they automatically trigger, right? They're connected to correlation, they're connected to who voted for whom, but not why.
But
Why can we investigate?
Yeah.
And I think it should be. This is a very important development.
that's why I'm saying, like in the survey data, there is a splitting happening on these conceptual categories.
Right. Right. So I think maybe the coming, I mean, I'm sometimes consulted, not always, but I think we should see if says this Lokniti's next round can be informed by these kinds of conceptual considerations. I think we should maybe put in this question, like why, as opposed to how you voted, who you voted for.
Right, that's not the focus.
Yeah. Maybe focus on that.
On this
Finally,
point, if I-
BJP is the urban party. How can we decide? Yeah.
No, I just wanted to ask, okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know this subject at all, but you seemed, what about economic, the perception that you could have social and economic mobility, even though the vertical hierarchy is maintained. It could be a sense that you, as a voter, you trade off between identity and also your economic. I mean, I'm surprised that the economic discussion is very limited and Partha didn't bring it up. I'm a bit,
And as like what.
I mean, I could feel that maybe I will.
Labharti argument is the economic, that is the social welfare schemes of the Modi era, the toilets, the cooking gas, the water in the post-29 era. So that doesn't apply to 29. 29 data could be linked to the benefits that came through the new what Urban Subramanian calls new welfareism. And I think my sense is it's once again it's a multi-factor equation. And I think these benefits would play a role in that, significant role. And we haven't asked that directly. See, the reason I'm hesitant to say is that we haven't asked that directly. In almost every survey, you will have to stop at 1 hour, right? You will get very wrong answers after that. So you really have to draw a line there. So we understand that things will be cut out and something will be included. But now these very conceptually important questions, I hope we can persuade CSDs locally to include that. Because there is probably a very clear connection. It won't be a sole determinant, I think. But if it's a sole determinant, then benefits have overpowered identity questions, right? Or identity redefined as a Hindu, let's say, or through Sanskritization, plus benefits have gone together. That would be the other way to think about that. Sanskritization plus benefits have gone together to generate this remarkable, a novel voting result, namely nearly half of OBC is going to be and nearly 1/3 of the Dalits. It's Sanskritization plus benefits could be, in a way, that's an easy conceptual way out, but it's certainly worth considering. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's close it here. Thank you so much, Ashu and Partha, for joining us. And we had a lovely conversation for almost
Benefits remain when posted.
for almost 2 hours. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll meet on 24th. That would be the 6th event in the series, and we'll discuss narratives on the ground with a couple of people on 24th, and the event would be on Zoom. Thank you, Ashu and Partha again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rahul. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Partha.